When Karolina entered the world was not yet ready for electricity, telephone communication, or cinema, but it already fervently believed in the ideals of beauty, virtue, and destiny granted from above. Germany was just learning to be Germany, and Freiburg remained a city of bustling markets, blooming chestnut trees, and a clear division between the worthy and everyone else. The Walter family was characterized by strictness, good upbringing, and an unspoken rule of not complaining. Karolina was born in 1850, a child who would later be said that not even sorrow could dim her light. Fate demanded its price from her early on. Her parents passed away, and the girl, along with her older sister Selma, was taken in by their grandmother. This was not a romantic turn of events. It was a necessity, like a cup of cold soup on a damp evening. Their grandmother became everything to them, and her home a temporary island of safety, where children's laughter was hushed. But this island, too, eventually sank. When their grandmother died, the sisters were left alone. Selma, already married, grown, schooled in pain, almost maternal. And Karolina, young, with eyes reflecting a dream and a challenge. They settled together in Selma's husband's house, and there, amidst cabinets filled with lace doilies, behind closed curtains, the slow work on their future unfolded. Karolina was not just beautiful, she belonged to that rare breed that cannot be precisely described, but is impossible to forget. Contemporaries would say, "She looks like she stepped out of an engraving," and in those words lay envy, admiration, and a touch of fear. It is unknown if she was truly perfect, or if it was merely a myth born from longing. But even if it was a myth, it was a remarkably persistent one. Karolina attended a prestigious girls' school, studied music and literature, knew how to speak with restraint and listen attentively. She did not demand attention. It flowed to her as naturally as wax to a flame. At balls, those rare, eagerly awaited evenings where the cream of Freiburg society gathered, her appearance was like the sound of a fanfare. She did not flirt, provoke, or play games. She simply entered, and men forgot why they had come, and women involuntarily compared themselves. The young Walter possessed that captivating allure that frightens, silent, unattainable, almost otherworldly. Whispers, predictions, and delight swirled around her. It was said she was destined for a brilliant match, a wealthy merchant, or perhaps a noble suitor.
But if you were even slightly familiar with the biographies of those who were too much, too beautiful, too intelligent, too otherworldly, you can already guess where this story is heading. Karolina's life was not leading to a wedding. It was leading to an abyss, imperceptible and insidious, like a quiet crack beneath a lacquered parquet floor. In the summer of 1867, when the air trembled with heat and the gardens smelled of mown grass, Karolina fell ill. First, a slight cough, then fatigue, then a high fever that neither vinegar nor poultices could break. The house filled with anxiety, as if time itself had stopped, awaiting a verdict. Selma called for doctors, pored over medical books, and prayed. Consumption, a word that in the 19th century sounded like a sentence veiled in crepe. The illness of romantic heroines and real horror. Karolina was fading. Those who saw her in July would not have recognized her in August. Her eyes lost their luster. Her skin became thinner than paper. Her hands could no longer even hold a mug of broth. And all this in complete silence, in a hushed house where no one believed in miracles anymore, but pretended to. On August 19th, she passed away, quietly, without a scream, without a struggle, as if she didn't want to frighten anyone. Selma lost not just a sister, she lost her anchor, her mirror, the other half of herself. She lost her without warning, without a last word, and from that moment on, her entire life became a dedication, not in a figurative sense, in a literal one, because memory is a stubborn thing, and love, if it is true, does not allow forgetting. One can drown in grief, or one can transform it into a monument. Selma chose the latter. Her sorrow did not cry out, did not tear at her hair. It was honed, like marble, day after day. She did not cry out when she saw Karolina in a white shroud. She did not faint, did not unleash hysterical wails through the house. She simply sat. Then she stood up and began to look for a sculptor. No wreaths, no lamentations, no obligatory plaque with gilded letters. She wanted Karolina to remain, not in memory, but in stone, so that everyone who came to her grave would see not death, but a continuation of life. Selma commissioned a sculpture, not an allegory, not an angel. She insisted it had to be an exact replica of her sister, as she was remembered in her final months, pale, fading, but still beautiful. A local craftsman named Burghardt hesitated at first. The task was not easy, to sculpt not a symbol, but a person, not a plaster ideal, but a soul frozen on the brink of vanishing. But he agreed, and he carved the figure, not a statue, but a dream. Karolina lay on a stone bed, as if on a couch, covered by the folds of a blanket. The sculptor even carved a book in her hand, open, as if her reading had been interrupted. Her face was serene, her features youthful. There was no sadness in them, only peace, as if this girl had not departed, but simply dozed off on a quiet summer day.
When the tombstone was installed in the cemetery, people were immediately drawn to it. There were no advertisements, no announcements, just whispers, curiosity, and an almost superstitious fear. The monument was too lifelike. Some recoiled, crossing themselves. Others stood, unable to leave. Karolina looked through the centuries, her eyes closed. It seemed as if one could reach out and touch someone's unmelted youth. The sculpture disrupted the usual order of things. It refused to let one forget that behind every cross, behind every dated stone, there was a life, a personality, eyes, hair, a voice. One could not simply pass by this grave. It was impossible to generalize. It demanded a personal connection. It awakened memories even in those who had never known Karolina. Rumors quickly spread through the city. Some said it was a copy of a princess, others that the tombstone was cursed. But most agreed on one thing. It was the Sleeping Beauty. Not because people craved a fairy tale, but because the reality was unbearable. The death of a young girl, carved with such love and precision, seemed grotesquely unjust. People who hadn't known Karolina began to feel a longing for her. This grave became more than a memory. It became an icon of the lost.
Selma, having fulfilled her vision, sought no fame. She rarely visited the cemetery, not out of indifference, but because each visit was like a surgical operation on a living wound. But one day, a few days after the funeral, she returned and saw something strange. Amidst the withered funeral bouquets left at the burial, there was a fresh flower. One, carefully placed in the hands of the stone Karolina. She thought it was a coincidence. Then, perhaps, someone from the family who came later. But the next day, the story repeated itself. And again, and again. Every morning, as if by schedule, a fresh flower appeared on the tombstone. A rosebud, a sprig of lavender, sometimes a miniature bouquet, and always without a signature, without explanation. Selma began to watch. She questioned the cemetery attendants. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. No one had come. The flowers simply appeared, as if left by someone invisible, or someone who knew how to vanish before dawn. Thus, a legend was born, first in whispers, then louder. The city began to speak of a secret admirer, of a young man who was in love with Karolina, of a tragedy he couldn't survive, perhaps an unfulfilled fiancé, perhaps someone who was not allowed to confess his feelings, or perhaps someone who was a day too late. The legend grew like ivy on a wall. It entwined all conversations. It sprouted through the voids. And increasingly, not only mourners and relatives, but also onlookers came to the cemetery. People went to see not death, but love. Silent, endless, nameless devotion. And no one dared to touch those flowers, because they were sacred. They were a symbol of what doesn't usually happen. But in this case, it did, and continued to do so.
Legends easily grow around hazy events. They are fueled by silence, mystery, and understatement. But in the story of Karolina Walter, it all began not with haze, but with absolute clarity. Flowers appeared at her grave daily, without exception, without pause, without explanation. And the more time passed, the less likely a coincidental explanation became. People, of course, tried to find a rational answer. A lonely romantic who never got over his loss. A former admirer living in the shadows. Perhaps an old man to whom Karolina had simply smiled once in her youth. But this devotion had no face, and because of that, it became almost mythical. Selma, though immersed in grief, felt a strange relief. Someone, besides her, cared that the world had lost Karolina. These modest bouquets were a restrained but constant response, a gesture of silent solidarity in suffering. She didn't know who this person was, and perhaps she didn't want to know. Mystery is sometimes more important than truth. Mystery makes love eternal. It doesn't depend on names. It doesn't fade with biographical details. Meanwhile, Karolina's sculpture continued to draw not only mourners, but also onlookers, dreamers, and casual passers-by. Her tombstone became a kind of relic. People came not just to the cemetery, but to a specific grave. Sometimes to leave a flower next to the one already resting in the girl's hands.
sometimes to stand in silence that no one disturbed, sometimes to touch something real that was missing from their own too noisy lives. Months passed, then years, then decades. Selma grew old, as those who lost half of themselves too early grow old, with restraint, quickly and inevitably. She no longer sought an answer, she simply came. And each time she saw a new reminder, a rose, a violet, sometimes a sprig of heather. The flowers changed, but their meaning remained the same. It was not just a gesture, it was a relay of memory passed down like a testament that required no words. Over time, the story acquired details. Some said Karolina's beloved was a soldier who went to war, and when he returned, she was already gone. Others whispered that Karolina's parents forbade them to be together due to social inequality, and he never forgave himself for not running away with her. There were also those who claimed Karolina had not died of illness at all, but of a broken heart, and the flowers on her grave became a silent confession of guilt. The truth drowned in the rustling of conjecture. Yes, there was Karolina. Yes, there was death. Yes, there was a tombstone. Everything else was ephemeral, like dreams from which one never awakens. But one thing remained beyond doubt. Every day, in any weather, in any era, there among the leaves and stone slabs, on the chest of the stone girl, fresh flowers continued to appear. Not bouquets from a shop, not artificial decorations, living, fragile, real. Flowers that someone brought or continued to bring on behalf of someone who once loved.
And this detail, strangely enough, transformed the entire tragedy into something more. It was no longer just the story of a girl who left too soon. It was evidence that even in a cemetery, even surrounded by darkness, there could be light. And this light was not from candles, nor from lamps, nor from pious epitaphs, but from flowers. Ordinary flowers, placed in the hands of one who once simply closed her eyes and remained with us forever. Over time, the city began to treat Karolina's grave not as a private family crypt, but as a sacred territory where the personal intertwined with the collective, and one family's pain with the dreams of thousands. The sculpture of the young girl ceased to be just a tombstone. It became a mirror, and everyone who came saw in this mirror their own loss, love, hope, guilt, the inability to say what matters most. Karolina's death ceased to be the tragedy of one household. It became an archetype, like Juliet, like Ophelia, like one who could not be saved in time. Recall what a cemetery is in a city. It's not just a place where people are buried. It's the geography of memory. And in this geography, Karolina became an entire continent. At her tombstone, people made appointments, brought guests, took pictures, argued, cried, and remained silent. Children heard in passing, "Look, this is the sleeping beauty." And then they started asking why she was sleeping and when she would wake up. And adults, unable to answer directly, made up stories, because the truth was too heavy, too deep. The tombstone truly resembled a fairy tale. It was too perfect to be just a monument. The folds of the blanket seemed to move, the features of the face warm, as if the marble were about to melt. The girl had not died. She had retreated into the depths of time, into a quiet, unattainable slumber.
It was not an image of the deceased, it was an image of hope, frozen in stone. Hope that love would remain even when all else disappeared. But even a fairy tale needs shadows. An overly lifelike monument frightened people. Some whispered that at night she opened her eyes, that her fingers moved if you looked long enough, that on certain days of the year you could hear the pages of the book in her hand being turned. Superstitions are an inevitable continuation of memory that doesn't know how to cope with pain. After all, if one cannot accept loss, it is easier to believe in magic. Some began to believe that Karolina had truly fallen asleep, not departed, and that the flowers were an attempt to wake her up, as in a fairy tale, that love is stronger than death, and therefore, sooner or later, she would awaken. Others were more stoic. They saw in it a reminder of the brevity of life, the transience of beauty, how easily fragments of the future become shards of the past. Whatever the case, in each of these perspectives lay fear. Fear of losing forever. Fear that even the brightest things disappear. And it was this fear that became the foundation of a cult that subtly formed around the grave. People came not for aesthetics, they came to be comforted, to be filled, to be reminded that feelings do not die with the body.
The townsfolk, initially simply surprised by the unusual tombstone, now began to perceive Karolina as something more. Her image was included in city tours, engravings, postcards, and articles appeared. A name that could have been forgotten within a few years became part of the city's folklore. Freiburg's Sleeping Beauty. It sounds almost like a landmark. But behind this name, behind the smooth phrasing, there was still a real girl. With her voice, her pain, her perhaps unspoken words. Karolina, having once fallen into an eternal sleep beneath the marble shroud, became an image. And images live longer than people. People came and went, flowers appeared and withered, but the sculpture remained. And every time a new bouquet was placed on the stone bed, something happened that made life worth living. Love, which could not be helped, still continued to exist. Because there, amidst the autumn leaves, amidst the old slabs, where silence and oblivion usually reigned, one grave lived its own life. And even if no one knew exactly who that invisible giver was anymore, everyone felt someone was there. Someone came, or perhaps continues to come to this day. Time, as is known, erases much, memories, faces, even traces on stone. But the flowers at Karolina Walter's grave did not disappear. On the contrary, the further the years went by, the clearer the tradition itself became. It seemed as if it was being honed like a ritual. In the morning, a fresh bouquet. In the evening, an empty alley. At night, and everything started anew. No one saw who brought them. No one knew how or when. But the flowers were there, always. At first it seemed a touching exception, then a romantic city mystery, and then it took the form of an almost mystical fact. Decades passed. Those who knew Karolina personally, who wept at her funeral, who loved or envied her, all of them were gone. Even Selma, the devoted sister, the restrained guardian of her memory, she too dissolved into eternity, leaving behind only a shadow and a name. Generations changed in the city.
Houses fell and new ones were built, rulers changed, Christmas trees were decorated, and wars thundered, and the marble girl still had a fresh flower lying beside her. No pauses, neither in the rain, nor in the snow, nor in the heat. It was said that even during World War II, when there was not enough bread and the city buzzed with sirens, Karolina continued to have fresh flowers. This sounded improbable, almost a defiance, and yet one fact remained: the flowers were there.
This couldn't happen, but it did. And everyone who happened to be nearby felt a strange, almost primal excitement. This constancy, this faithfulness, this silence saturated with anticipation made a far stronger impression than any inscriptions on gravestones. Some tried to stake out the mysterious giver, slept in the bushes, set up observers. But no one ever saw him. The flowers simply appeared, as if brought by the wind, as in a fairy tale. But a fairy tale is not an explanation. It is a crack in reality from which truth, inexpressible by formula or common sense, suddenly begins to pour. Over time, versions multiplied. One, old but persistent, claimed that Karolina had a lover. Secret, unwanted, perhaps not wealthy, or simply not approved by the family. And supposedly he swore that he would always come to her, even when it was too late. No one knew him, his name was not preserved, and whether he existed at all is unknown. But the flowers spoke for him. They were letters without text, prayers without words, promises that are fulfilled even after the disappearance of the one who gave them. Others said this person was simply a romantic, a madman, obsessed with someone else's story, suffering from his loneliness, finding solace in ritual. And someone else, with a whisper and apprehension, said that perhaps it wasn't one person, that it was already a tradition passed down by someone and now carried on by others, passed on like a family heirloom, like a secret covenant. One leaves, another continues, without words, without slogans, simply brings flowers. There were even those who suggested that the flowers appeared on their own, by Karolina's own will, according to some incomprehensible laws of space and time. That her love, or someone's love for her, was so strong that matter itself dared not resist. Of course, this sounded naive, childish, but what can you counter these words with when you stand before the stone girl and in her hands lies a rose still damp with morning dew? More than a century and a half has passed since the first bouquet appeared at Karolina's grave. By the most conservative estimates, over 50,000 fresh flowers have been laid there during this time. Not wreaths, not plastic, not random herbs, but precisely flowers brought by someone who refused to let her be forgotten. 50,000 is not just a number. It is a measure of love, or longing, or a promise that neither time, nor death, nor fatigue could erase. Thus, a tradition that began with a single gesture became a city miracle, unofficial but alive. And even if you are a skeptic, even if you don't believe in century-long devotion, even if you prefer calculation to symbols, you cannot remain indifferent. Because in a world where everything changes too quickly, there is a place where one story continues, without words, without advertising, without an audience. And perhaps it is precisely such stories that are the only things truly worth remembering. The longer this strange tradition, devoid of logic and fatigue, continued, the less one wanted to search for a rational explanation. The city had almost stopped asking who exactly was bringing the flowers, because the very attempt to find the giver's name seemed sacrilegious, as if by knowing the truth you would destroy the fragile balance where feelings do not require passports. The mysterious guest who came to Karolina was needed precisely because he remained a shadow. His silence, his invisibility, his constancy made him far more real than any official obituary. Selma, who outlived her sister but not her grief, in the last years of her life stopped wondering who it was. She simply knew someone was nearby, someone remembered. Someone perhaps also lived only halfway, the part that had departed with Karolina. Perhaps he had once promised her eternal devotion, or perhaps he made the promise to himself. It no longer mattered. What mattered was this: every day, this person, if he existed, made the same choice again and again, to be near, despite everything. The legend grew with new details. Some claimed to have once seen the silhouette of a man in black standing by the tombstone at dawn. Others said that on moonlit nights, fresh footprints appeared in the cemetery, leading from the gate straight to Karolina. There were even anonymous letters to the newspaper, written in an elegant, old-fashioned script, where the author confessed his eternal love for a girl he claimed to have known during her lifetime. Perhaps all this was fiction, or perhaps it was the cry of a soul who couldn't cope with loss and found refuge in an old story. More prosaic theories also emerged. It was said that the flowers were brought not out of love, but out of habit, that a once romantic impulse had long become a cultural ritual imitated by new generations. Supposedly, it was no longer a person, but a whole line of keepers, those who passed the role on like a relay race to keep the urban legend alive. This sounded logical, and yet there was something offensive in this logic, as if feelings could be planned like a train schedule. But try it yourself. Go to that cemetery early in the morning, when the fog has not yet lifted, when the air is filled with coolness and everything around seems frozen. Look at the white statue, at the delicate fingers holding a fresh flower not yet bloomed. Look closely at how carefully it is placed, how tenderly it is nestled in her hands, as if the giver truly wanted not just to adorn the grave, but to talk to the one who lies there. And then, any version, even the most reasonable, will seem too impoverished. Even if we assume that all of this is a game of memory, a collective poem written by the city's inhabitants for solace, why does it continue? Why does no one tire? Why is this gesture, devoid of benefit, without photos, likes, or even spectators, repeated with the same tenderness as the first time? Perhaps love, which was not allowed to happen, does not disappear, but transforms into a duty, into an endless, irrational, stubborn duty to remember, not to let go, to continue.
Some philosophers said that true love is what was not realized. Everything that happened already belongs to the past, and what did not come to pass remains forever in a state of anticipation, anxiety, purity. Karolina is anticipation, an unopened letter, an unmade choice, an unfinished dance. Her image became not a monument to a specific person, but a symbol of what we lose within ourselves when we let someone go too soon. And that is precisely why the flowers continued to appear. Because Karolina is not just a tragic figure. She is a reminder of ourselves, of our capacity for fidelity, for tenderness, for a senseless but beautiful persistence that nothing can erase. When a year passes, we forget. When 10 years pass, we get used to it. But when half a century passes, habit crumbles to dust, and only the essence remains. Karolina Walter's story, strangely enough, did not disappear. On the contrary, it became clearer, as if someone was wiping it from the inside through the glass of time. The flowers continued to appear, not seasonally, not by calendar, not on special dates. They were always there, and this always had ceased to be just a word. Gradually, the memory of Karolina herself began to dissolve, not in the sense of disappearing, but on the contrary, in the sense of spreading. She ceased to be just a girl from Freiburg. She became a symbol, a ghost of the beautiful whom they did not manage to protect. The human face lost its sharp contours, but the light remained, as after lightning, when the figure disappears, but the air still trembles from the discharge. Decades later, when there were no living witnesses left, when not only those who knew Karolina, but also those who knew her had gone into the earth, flowers still lay in the hands of the stone girl. They say that in the 1920s, particularly rare buds were found at the grave, those that do not grow in the Black Forest. In 1943, when the whole world was plunging into hell, Karolina's tombstone, by a strange coincidence, remained unharmed. Bombs fell in another district. The front line passed by. And even then, under the howling sirens, in the smoke, in fear, a fresh rose lay on her chest in the morning. The townspeople stopped being surprised. At first, it was a phenomenon to be discussed, then simply known, then immutable. It was like the cathedral, like the clock on the town hall, like a stream flowing through ancient canals, a presence that required no explanation. Some came only for the flowers, others to lay them, but no one asked why, because it was clear it was not for her, it was for us, so that we would know that love can be stronger than time, stronger than old age, stronger than war, stronger than amnesia, stronger than all those forces that usually win.
One historian, researching cemetery archives, tried to establish the chain of givers. He looked for signatures in visitors' books, studied flower receipts, interrogated custodians. But, as often happens in stories that become larger than facts, his research yielded nothing. And all he finally said, standing at the tombstone, was, "I am glad I found no one." Because a legend, not caught in the net of logic, preserves its soul. And if you strip away the veil of mystery, all that remains is a skeleton, dead and faceless. Skeptics argued that the tradition was driven by tourist interest, that the flowers were from excursionists, from local florists, from those who wanted to become part of the myth. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps no one remembers how it all began long ago. Perhaps it was all a coincidence that became a system. But then one must admit, even a coincidence repeated with love becomes a ritual. And even if these flowers are just an act of imitation, something devoid of face and history, does that make them less beautiful? Does the fact that they are no longer supported by specific pain make them empty? On the contrary, it is pain that has become universal, like music which has no composer but still sounds if you start listening to it. Every morning, every new day, every generation entering the gates of the old Freiburg cemetery sees not just a grave, it sees proof that immortality is possible, not physical, not religious, but human. That love can be an action that requires no recognition, that memory can do without names. Karolina Walter became a legend not because she died young, and not because she was beautiful, but because someone, or many, did not allow her to disappear. Because someone decided, even if everything is meaningless, love will remain. Even if no one knows your name, the flowers will speak for you. At some point, it became clear that if the mysterious guest still existed, then he had long ceased to be a person of flesh and blood. Age took its toll, and even the most desperate dreamers could no longer seriously believe that the same person had been coming to Karolina for over a century and a half. It would have been physically impossible. Too many years had passed. Too many generations had changed. Too much had disappeared without a trace. But the flowers remained, and from this starting point, reality began to slowly dissolve into symbol. Thus, a new legend was born. According to it, Karolina's secret lover did not die. He became something like a spirit, a guardian, a shadow that comes every night to her tombstone. Sometimes in human form, sometimes like the wind that brings petals. It was said that on a full moon he could be seen out of the corner of an eye at the moment when you look past and suddenly feel someone's presence. There were those who swore they saw buds appear before their very eyes, as if materializing from the air, as a sign, as a trace of someone's love that did not require a body.
Of course, this sounds like fiction, and perhaps it is indeed fiction. But the paradox is that in this story, the truth is not in the details, not in the facts, not in verifiable sources. It is in people's reactions, in the fact that no one, upon learning of this phenomenon, laughs, does not mock, does not dismiss, because intuitively everyone feels there is something real behind this, something that eludes logic, but not the heart. Gradually, the idea of a personal giver transformed, and the place of one nameless individual was taken by a chain, or rather a stream. The notion that the tradition, which began in grief, continued through a chain of those who decided not to interrupt it. That each of us, if only we want to, has the opportunity to become that very person who brings flowers. Perhaps just once, perhaps not to Karolina, but to someone or something, in memory, out of love, for no reason. And perhaps herein lies the main secret of Karolina Walter's grave. It is not a monument to a young girl. It is an altar to human capacity for fidelity, for a ritual that no one demands, but someone still performs, day after day, without loud words, without spectators, simply because it cannot be otherwise. Freiburg's sleeping beauty has long since transcended her era, her surname, even her human form. She has become an image of eternal expectation, an image of love that needs no answer, an image of grief that does not wound, but also does not pass. Her story is not just a tale of a beautiful girl who left too soon. It is a chronicle of hope that in a world full of loss and forgotten faces, something can remain. Even if everything around changes, even if everything collapses, even if the very concepts of love and duty seem archaic, naive, outdated, still, somewhere in silence, every morning, a hand is found that places a flower in the hands of the stone girl, without witnesses, without a camera, without a signature. And this gesture is louder than a cry, because it contains no fear, no demands, no self-sacrifice, only pure presence,
that form of love that requires no answer. Or perhaps it is no longer love at all, but something older, deeper, an attachment to the very idea that one can be present even when everything is over, that one can remember, not out of guilt, but because memory is stronger than time. And then the flowers at Karolina's grave become not only a symbol of departed love, but also a promise. Even in a world that forgets everything, there is someone who remembers. As always happens with stories that live too long without an ending, a true mythology began to form around Karolina Walter. The legend ceased to be a personal drama and acquired the scale of a cultural phenomenon. It was no longer just one girl's fate. It was the city's nerve, a pulse that time had imperceptibly touched.
In Freiburg, whispers began to spread that a shadow appeared in the cemetery at night. Not clear, not frightening, but tangible, as if the air thickened around a single point, drawn by a force that even death could not break. Some said they saw a tall man in an old coat standing by the tombstone, his head bowed in silent prayer. Others, that they heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel when they themselves were in complete solitude. There were even those who claimed that the brown eyes of the marble girl briefly opened, as if she were checking if everything was still there, if everything was continuing. Mysticism, as usual, came where the truth was too sharp. It became a form of relief, a way to preserve emotion without naming it directly. And people, despite the skepticism of the era, accepted this mythology as something self-evident. Because in every culture, on every continent, and in every century, humanity needed symbols to confirm that feelings do not die, that between this world and the next there is a subtle connection. And Karolina Walter became just such a connecting bridge. School children on excursions listened to her story with bated breath. Elderly passerbys touched the wrought iron fence with respect, as if greeting her. Young lovers came here as a sign of devotion, placing a flower, not because they had to, but because otherwise they felt like traitors. Someone whispered a name, someone their request. Because at some point, Karolina ceased to be just the deceased. She became something like a saint, but not canonized, not religious, but deeply human, a saint of memory, of loss, and of unquenched love. Stories began to emerge that the girl in white, with a calm face and an open book in her hands, appeared in people's dreams, that she stood silently in doorways and disappeared, leaving a feeling of warmth. Some even claimed that the flowers left at her grave seemed to bring good luck, if done sincerely, without pretense, without seeking anything in return. These stories were not officially recorded. They did not appear in newspapers, but they lived on, from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. And now it no longer matters who was first, who started it, who laid that very first rose in the folded hands of the stone girl. Because now everyone who brings flowers becomes part of the story, its co-author, a participant in an eternal ritual. And therein lay the strength, in the endless transmission of love that is not tied to one person, to one era, to one tragedy. It was memory woven into the fabric of the city, into its roots, into its silence. In the post-war years, as the city was rebuilding, as people were losing more than they could name, Karolina Walter's grave stood untouched. Even the harshest winds of time did not touch it. The fence did not rust, the sculpture did not crack, and the flowers, as before, appeared. In this was a challenge, or perhaps evidence. Whatever happened to the world, however it changed, however distant we grew from each other, there would always be someone who remembered, who brings, who preserves.
And if you look at this story as architecture, then Karolina Walter's tombstone became the central column of the entire building we call love that has not lost its meaning. Because there, amidst old stones and winding paths, amidst birdsong and winter silence, lies a girl who left too soon, but remained. Because someone, or a whole series of those who cared, did the impossible, gifted eternity without words, through flowers, through ritual, through memory that requires no proof. Of course, much has changed in our time. The flowers at Karolina Walter's grave are likely no longer brought by that same secret lover, if he truly ever existed. It is much more likely that fresh buds are left by tourists inspired by the story, or by local residents touched by the years-long history. The age of technology, social media, and fast memory has long since come into its own, and even the most enduring symbols turn into photo objects. Now, next to the tombstone, there is a plaque. Sometimes QR codes appear, guidebooks, stylized postcards. Karolina's grave has become a landmark, a place of power, a point on the cultural route map. And yet, this does not negate anything, because there is no falsehood in the very fabric of this story. Not a single utilitarian layer, not a drop of fake drama. Even if today the flowers are brought by strangers, even if each of them has their own motivation, accidental or conscious, still, each of these gestures continues that very chain. Otherwise, why do they come here specifically? Why to this girl, whose name has long disappeared from archives, but whose shadow continues to live in stone, in petals, in human memories? Everyone who stands before Karolina's tombstone finds themselves not just a spectator of someone else's tragedy, but also a participant in something rare, an act of unprompted, selfless memory. This is not a place of mourning, it is a place of participation, where the living remember not so much the deceased, but the very capacity to love, quietly, for a long time, without confirmation, where even death becomes not a boundary, but a form of dialogue, where flowers are not a perfunctory sign of politeness, but a symbol that feelings can be conveyed without being named. And perhaps this is the true essence of Karolina Walter's entire story. It does not require analysis. It does not ask for truth. It does not need to be exposed. It exists as a warm trace of touch, like a subtle aroma, like a familiar motive heard through the noise. This story does not shout. It breathes. Because love, even if unrequited, even if unfulfilled but sincere, can live longer than the body, longer than time, longer than names. Because a ritual performed in silence does not need applause. Because memory, even if no one ordered it to be, can remain, and remain beautiful. Which means that in a world where forgetting has become a habit, we still have a chance. As long as there is someone who places a flower, as long as there is someone who stands silently and watches, as long as there is a place where a young girl sleeps not an eternal, but a fairy tale sleep, and every passerby feels that she has not been let go, and will not be.